Welcome, everyone. Sorry about that technical snafu there. So tonight we are going to continue our journey talking about how we got the Bible. This is lesson number 5 tonight, and it's been, I'm sure, a little bit detailed at some points, and covering some facts and data that may not seem relevant, but as we move forward in time, we're going to be referring back to some of these things. And a couple weeks ago, we talked about the important finding or the important work of Konstantin Tischendorf. And he was a very important person dedicating his life to finding early Greek manuscripts that are very valuable to us today. And it's interesting to see how these things have transpired and moved forward. So what we have done so far in our study, when we're talking about the Greek manuscripts, we went through a couple of lessons, and we talked about the uncials, the minuscules, the lectionaries, and some of the papyri, which is coming up. But these are what we're going to call the primary sources of the scriptures, and how we validate that what we have today matches what the apostles and the early writers actually wrote. Tonight, we're going to move forward and talk about what we call secondary sources. Anybody have an idea why we would call this list of different languages secondary sources?
Translate from a different language.
Yeah, these are all translations into different languages, which is a natural evolution of the Bible and the scriptures, because who was speaking Greek? Well, not everybody. So we're going to move forward and we're going to start talking about. But as we're going to learn, when you do translate from Greek into another language, there's potentially some changes or some loss. And so what we find here is very important. But when you're talking about converting from one language to another, sometimes there's just not a word that matches the original meaning so well. And so that's what we're going to find as we look at some of these versions. But this is a very important part of the story of going through the Bible and learning how it was, how we got the Bible today. So before we move ahead and get into lesson 5, which is going to cover chapters 6 and 7 tonight, let's bow for a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the time that we have to come together in the middle of the week to study another portion of your will. And in this class, we are studying about how we got the Bible. And we are so thankful for your providence and for your hand in seeing fit that your word is being transmitted through the ages so that we today and all men can see and understand your word. Please be with our church family. Help those who are struggling with their health and need your care. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so tonight, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about the ancient versions that were needed to spread the gospel. Not everybody understood and spoke Greek across the world. As the word and these letters started to spread out, the need for different languages came about. And then we'll talk a little bit about the manuscripts of special interest. Let's get right into this. These are going to be versions or translations. So if we were to take a letter and translate it from English to Spanish, for example, the Spanish would be the translation or a version of the original copy letter and the text. Because they are translations, we refer to them as secondary, and because there's some meanings that are lost as you translate from one language to another. And it doesn't matter what 2 languages you pick. you're not going to find words in every language that match up with the original meaning of a particular language. The gospel that was proclaimed in different tongues on the day of Pentecost needed to be written, and as they were carried to different countries like Egypt, or carried over into Turkey, or wherever, as these letters were copied and then carried, it was important to come up with copies that could be understood and read by those different countries. After the apostolic messages began to circulate in Greek among early Christians, the next step was to circulate these same messages in other tongues. Whenever or wherever Greek was unknown or unnatural, translations from Greek into the native languages began to spring up. Of these three were very early and are these three particular languages: the Syriac, Latin, and the Coptic, which is Egyptian. These are the ones that are of specific and chief importance. So those are the ones we're going to talk about in more detail. The Latin is the one we're going to spend more time about, and you'll see why as we get into that. The Syriac versions are the main language spoken in the regions of Syria and Mesopotamia. And it's almost identical to Aramaic, which was spoken in Palestine. That's what Jesus spoke, and the people of Israel spoke at the time of Jesus being on the earth. And it was undoubtedly one of the earliest translations to be made, the Syriac. So it was first probably converted or translated into Syriac. So there are three different versions within Syriac. The first one being the Diatessaron. This is Greek term for through the four Gospels. So those were the common ones that people wanted to hear and to share. And it is really the earliest form of Syriac. Tatian returned to his home near the year AD 170. At about the time he compiled his harmony by merging the four Gospels into one continuous account of the life of Christ. So here's an important point. This is one of the first instances where they combined and put the four Gospels into one book or one account. Tatian's harmony circulated widely and was so popular that special measures had to be taken in the 5th century to remove it from use in Syrian churches. So it became very popular and was spread throughout the churches once again to be read. And keep in mind, not everybody could read it. And now there are some people who were skeptical that there really was a Diatessaron because it disappeared. It fell into oblivion. Its text must be perfectly constructed on the basis of secondary sources. So today we don't necessarily have evidence, but there's secondary sources that keep referring to it as, yes, it did exist, and it was very popular in the early church period. Then there's what we call the Old Syriac. The Old Syriac is something that was in the 19th century, became known that there was such an early translation. So there was discoveries made that referred to it as the Old Syriac. Two chief manuscripts of the Old Syriac were the Curetonian Syriac and the Sinaitic Syriac. The Curetonian Syriac is a 5th century copy of the Gospels, consisting of over 80 leaves. And so it is so called because of the labors of Dr. William Cureton. In 1842, the British Museum obtained a large number of Syriac manuscripts that had come from one of the monasteries in the desert west of Cairo. So we know these were copies and translations that came up and appeared in other countries, in this case in Egypt. The Sinaitic manuscript was discovered in 1892 by widowed twin sisters, Mrs. Agnes Smith Lewis and Mrs. Margaret Dunlop Gibson. These Cambridge ladies were wealthy, eccentric, and intellectual. They came to a place we've seen before, St. Catherine's Monastery at Sinai, in quest of rare biblical manuscripts. And this is where Tischendorf made his astounding discovery, and here other important manuscripts were being uncovered. This is just a treasure house, ends up being more than one manuscript being found there. It's an interesting story because they found an old palimpsest document, which is one that was scraped off and then reprinted over. The layer underneath was identified by these two ladies as a Syriac copy of the Gospels. And it is the earliest known copy of the Old Syriac, reaching back to the 5th or possibly to the 4th century. The form of text found in Old Syriac is a mixed in character, containing Alexandrian type readings, but more often those that are Western. And interestingly, the Curetonian Syriac includes that Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20 that we talked about, we mentioned last week, is suspect because not all of these old manuscripts contain that second part of that chapter. And we'll talk more about that in future classes.
I think the date that you have it in the British Museum is not right.
You know, it's,
It can't be in the British Museum before it's discovered. Maybe it's 1942?
Oh, that's because there's two, that is misleading. Because there are two manuscripts here. One was found earlier than the other. In 1848 is when, but that's right, that's not right. Good catch. Should be 1848.
So that date is not for the one above it, Sinaitic manuscript.
Correct.
I'm not trying to pick apart what you're doing.
No,
Yeah,
but you are.
The Curetonian was the earlier manuscript.
Yeah.
The Sinaitic manuscript.
Yeah, this one was 1848, and this one,
That's the one that's in the British
yeah,
Museum, the Curetonian,
right.
not the Sinaitic.
So there's where you can go find it. Put your eyes on it, British Museum or the British Library. And then there's another one we call the Peshitta. This one is, the word means simple and refers to the standard Syriac translations, which have been in use since the 5th century. It is a revision of the Old Syriac based on Greek manuscripts that attest to an early form of the Byzantine type. And there are more than 300 manuscripts, or 350 manuscripts of this particular one. So this just gives you a flavor of some of the early manuscripts that are, as we mentioned, getting discovered and found in the middle 1800s and have a very important part to play in telling the story of where the Bible was translated, where it came from. Now we're going to move on to the Coptic versions. Coptic was the latest phase of the development of the ancient Egyptian language, which eventually came to be written in Greek characters. A number of Coptic dialects exist, but two are especially noteworthy: the Sahidic version and the Bohairic version. These are, the Sahidic version is written in the dialect of Upper Egypt or Southern Egypt. Remember, Egypt, when you refer to upper, you're talking about really the southern part. It's kind of reversed on the map because the Nile River flows north. And then extensive manuscripts have come to light dating to the 3rd and 4th centuries. So these are important versions to have available to also be a witness to the original translations in the original Bible. The Bohairic version refers to the dialect in lower or northern Egypt, and some manuscripts of those go back to the 4th and 5th centuries. So these are good quality texts, and it shows that the gospel of Christ made quick inroads into Egypt. So remember, that's where we found the Alexandrian Codex we mentioned earlier. So the gospel message of Christ has made it into Egypt. It's also spread more towards the west, on the north side of the Mediterranean.
Is the Alexandrian Codex in Greek still though?
It is, yeah. These are translations.
So in theory, somebody took that and translated it and made these.
Yes,
Potentially.
yes, it very well could have been. When you're discovering these things or uncovering these things, it's hard to trace back and see what version were they using sometimes to make their copy or make their translation. Okay, moving on to the Latin versions, or referred to as the Old Latin. These versions should hold special interest for all English-speaking people because the first translation of the English Bible was made from the Latin. So when we look at and start tracing back, this is one of the key versions that we can look at to see how that was translated into English. So in AD 180, persecution against the church in Namibia of North Africa, there is evidence where Christians were using books and letters of Paul, a just man. He was being interrogated by some official, and he said, what are you carrying? He said, well, I have books and letters of Paul, a just man. So there's inference there that he was carrying, even as early as 180, translations or copies of the Gospels. It is not likely that the people in Cilicium knew Greek, so by this time the epistles of Paul existed in Latin, and if Paul's letters were in Latin, surely the Gospels have been translated into Latin as well. So we can infer that if he was carrying letters of Paul, that most likely there were translations of the Gospels as well. When in the AD 50s, Paul wrote his letter to the Romans, of course, he wrote in Greek, and those would need to be translated into common languages in other places. The time was as early as AD 160 or before, and perhaps earlier for books of the Old Testament. These are informally, they were translated and made informally by missionaries or by local Christians to assist congregations in their worship. So remember, not everybody was able to read, and so there were people that were able to read in front of a congregation, and that's where these manuscripts and copies would appear. So it seems that the first Latin translations arose independently, differing from one another. More and more copies were made, and the eventual result was a number of variant readings among the Latin manuscripts. So this is an important point that we need to understand as we move forward in the story, because the next part of the story is very important. As these various copies were being made and translations, there was some variation. And so it became a particular concern as time went on to get a pure and authentic copy of the scriptures in Latin. So Latin was a fairly common language at that time. So now we need to introduce another key person. We talked about Tischendorf and the key role that he played. Now we're going to introduce a man by the name of Jerome, or his real name is Eusebius Hieronymus, and I'm not going to say that one anymore. Use Jerome as his name. That's who he's commonly known by today. Jerome is a name that you may hear. He was born about the year 345 at Strydo in Dalmatia, an area northwest of modern Greece. He was about 12. When his well-to-do parents sent him to Rome, where he studied advanced Latin, grammar, Greek, and the Latin classics. Later, his higher education concentrated on rhetoric designed for the career of a lawyer or civil servant. So here he's a young man that's getting educated in 3 of these very critical languages for the purpose of doing something like being a lawyer or a civil servant. But it is going to serve him very well in the area of translating the scriptures. He had only been nominally a Christian after leaving Rome. He committed himself to the life of an ascetic. And it's interesting, there's always interesting little stories, side stories along with these men. And this one, he says at Antioch, he was attacked with a severe fever and was near death. One of his letters relates what happened. In a dream, he was caught up before the judge's judgment seat and was asked to state his condition. He replied that he was a Christian, but the divine response was, "You lied. You are a Ciceronian, not a Christian." And so that particular dream had a significant impact on him and persuaded him to look more into the scriptures. It was a shattering experience. He resolved to devote the rest of his life to the study of the scriptures. Under the guidance of a converted Jew, he began to learn Hebrew. When therefore, in 382 to 83, Bishop Damascus of Rome saw the need of drawing together the various Old Latin translations into one official edition. And it just so happened that Jerome was serving Damascus as his secretary and translator. So he was the perfect candidate for taking this huge task on. So as we mentioned before, there were varying copies in Latin done by various Christians, but it was recognized by Bishop Damascus. He wanted one official edition that could be copied and produced and shared among the people. In 384, Jerome finished his revision of the 4 Gospels. And so now we have the first works and translation done by Jerome in 384, where he finished the 4 Gospels. Now, Damascus died in 384, but he continued his quest to do these translations. And he traveled to the Holy Land and took up residence in Bethlehem. Here he was able to continue his work on the Latin Bible and complete the Old Testament, converting it from Greek into Latin. So now, this was one of his primary life goals, and it says his only purpose was to restore Latin manuscripts to conform to the original Greek. So he was a student of the scriptures and wanted to make a clear and decisive conversion and translation into Latin. And he was able to do that in the year 384. Jerome is remembered today for his labor on the Latin Vulgate. Has anybody heard that term, the Latin Vulgate? Does that ring a bell with anybody? it may sound a little familiar. It's more in Catholic circles, where that's where they refer to Latin, and we'll talk more about that. But he is the one that is credited with the labor of making this standard Latin. And now,
Are we saying he did the entire Bible? or
yes, he ended up doing the whole
New
Bible.
Testament and the Gospel?
Yeah, and he was able to finish the whole New Testament. So it's interesting that he really didn't get much credit and much recognition for the work that he did during his lifetime, but it's after he died that his work became more and more recognized. So the term, or the Latin term Vulgata, means common or commonly accepted. His work was not commonly accepted. Remember, because there were all these different Latin copies that were in circulation, and the Archbishop wanted to have one particular version, a standardized version. So it was not until 1546, at the Council of Trent, that Jerome's version officially received the title Vulgate, but it had been generally accepted for and received long before this. So from that time, close to 1,000 years, it became the standard, recognized, commonly circulated version in Latin that was being used. In the 13th century in Paris, the need arose for a Bible that could be more easily used. Probably at this time, Stephen Langton, a leading theologian at the University of Paris, arranged the Vulgate into the modern chapter divisions still in use today. So it's interesting that even up until the 13th century, writings were still in those long columns that didn't have any breaks, no chapter breaks. You know, you still had to be very focused on how you were reading and how you were going through it. But now, in the 13th century, is the first person to take all those letters and somehow divide them up into more consumable chunks, and it matches what we see today in our modern Bible. So this is an important evolution in the Bible, the way it's written and carried forward for us today. So what is the value of these Latin versions? Well, it's quite a few significant items that we want to make note of. The Old Latin was the first made in the Latin tongue. The Vulgate copied 10,000 plus more than any other book in the Christian era. So it was the source that was being used to make copies going forward. Jerome, thankfully, did check the Greek manuscripts for his Latin translation. So not necessarily all those other copies in Latin did the same work and detail that Jerome is credited with doing. He went back because he knew Greek, he knew Latin, and then he learned Hebrew. So he was able to make a significant improvement in his work. The Vulgate reigned as the Bible of Western Europe for 1,000 years. After the Middle Ages, it was translated into the languages of the people. In 1456, the Gutenberg Bible was the Vulgate text. Remember, when the Gutenberg press was created and invented, the Vulgate was the text that was printed. Many words used in English translations are due to the Latin Vulgate. Words such as congregation, consecration, conversion, extortion, justification, ministry, sanctification. Remember, I mentioned that some languages have words that just don't have an equivalent word in the new language. So from Greek to Latin, these words were used because of that particular translation. Eventually, the Vulgate was made the official Bible of the Roman Catholic Church, and even today, the Roman Catholic Church refers to the Latin Vulgate as their source and their primary work. But keep in mind, Jerome didn't have access to those three primary Greek manuscripts that we've already talked about. He didn't have access to those those manuscripts that were authenticated back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And so he was using copies of copies. And so as more copies are made, small errors would tend to creep in. So to summarize this chapter 6, what we are seeing here, in addition to the Greek manuscripts, much information is available to us from ancient translations. These translations are secondary, but they are very helpful in validating what a particular book said and can confirm, and it's another resource, it's another witness. 3 of these are especially important: the Syriac, the Latin, and the Coptic. The Coptic versions, in particular, the Sahidic and the Bohairic, exhibit a good quality type of text that was current in Egypt early in the Christian era. Tatian's Harmony of the Gospels, known as the Diatessaron, may be the earliest form of the text in Syriac, but no manuscript of it has ever survived. Otherwise, the main Syriac versions are the Old Syriac and the Peshitta, the later being represented in more manuscripts, while the former is the more important as a witness to the text. It was Jerome who gave us the Latin Vulgate, which has led an incalculable influence on Western civilization because it was translated into English. In the West, the Latin Vulgate was the standard Bible for 1,000 years. Now, all of a sudden, we've gone from these versions, the Greek manuscripts, and now one particular version becomes dominant for 1,000 years. And Latin was the primary language of many civilizations around the world. So now we're going to jump into chapter 7, which is, we won't spend as much time there. We don't have as much time to deal with this, but there's some interesting information about some of these special manuscripts that are worth noting. So we just touched on a number of the versions. There are other versions that we could go look into, but as the author is trying to do, he's trying to tell this story and not go into too much detail in providing too much information. But we can see the importance of the Latin Vulgate in the progression of the transmittal of the scriptures. And now we're going to talk about something we call manuscripts of special interest, which has to do with helping the readers read the text. And we mentioned how back in the 1500s or the 13th century was when the first person actually broke those books up into chapters. But there's also some other interesting changes and aids that are helpful to the reader that are worthy of noting. A New Testament manuscript would include traditional titles for each book and often notes at the end of the book. These endnotes usually state where a book was written or by whom it was written or sent. The King James Version includes these notes at the end of each of Paul's letters. So if you go back and look at the original King James Version, it will include some of these things, some of these notes. It was divided into chapters, but not verses. yet the chapters were entirely different from those in our modern Bibles. So you can see in some versions, there were 68 chapters in the book of Matthew. Well, that's not what has been transmitted down to today. Mark had 48 chapters, Luke had 83 chapters in some of the different versions. There was notes or comments on the meaning of the text that were written in the margins, as the copyist would make notes and changes that we might, something like we are making notes that we're studying a Bible book, and we want to make notes because somebody made some special explanation. That's the kind of notes that you would see also made. Of special interest are the Eusebian canons. Eusebius, known as the father of church history, who lived in Palestine in the 4th century, was somehow responsible for a system of locating parallel passages of the gospel. So you've heard of the term synoptic gospels. That's where you see a chart. I've got one in my Bible that just lines up the story and shows which accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, contain that story, and then which ones don't. And you can see that was also created during this time. Another interesting aspect that was happening during the Middle Ages is something we call illuminated manuscripts. Illumination is a term applied to the decoration of manuscripts with colors or gold or silver. Portraits of the evangelist are the chief decoration found in many manuscripts at that time. Each portrait covers a full page and may be found at the beginning of each gospel or joined all together at the beginning of the codex. So now we're starting to see scribes wanting to enhance by putting pictures or illustrations within their text or on special pages to introduce the particular book that you're about to read. From early times, Christians had associated the 4 evangelists with the 4 living creatures of Ezekiel and Revelation. You'll see that reference back in those. So they began to make a connection between the 4 apostles, the 4 Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to these 4 creatures. Now, whether that's correct or not is unknown, but he does describe these 4 creatures in Ezekiel as having the form of men, each with 4 faces and each with 4 wings. The 4 faces are those of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. And so you can see here, this was supposed to be Matthew. They would put a picture like this at the front of the book of Matthew. And then this would be Mark, who was the lion, and then Luke would be an ox, and then John would be an eagle. So they just got very creative in illustrating the books and tried to put more character into their copies in order to help the common man read and understand what he was talking about. Then there were these sumptuous deluxe editions of the scriptures were produced, and these are ones that we have available to us today, a few of them. Here's a couple of pages from one that's called the Codex Amiatinus. It is the earliest surviving complete Vulgate. These are pages added to the text back to the 8th century. This one weighed about 75 pounds. Imagine carrying your Bible around 75 pounds. You wouldn't be carrying it around very much. You'd be leaving it at the place where you would read it. Today it's stored in the Grand Laurentian Library in Florence, Italy. So these are going to be starting to pop up more in the British Isles, over in European countries. Here, this one was found in Italy. there's some interesting stories behind some of these codexes that you can read in the book. Here is another one that is very famous, Landespeer Gospels, more diagrams, and just so intricate. But the one that apparently is just out of this world, and the detail that's put in it is one that's called the Book of Kells. And it's looked at and ranked by many scholars as the greatest wonder of the world. So this one is one that you have to go to Dublin to see it, and they put it on display there. So I'll let you read the summary on your own time, but now we have moved forward from here to here to, we've looked at ancient copies, we've looked at the ancient versions we covered tonight, and then we talked about the Vulgate. But you'll notice that's 400 AD. The next version significant version that we're going to talk about jumps about 1,000 years to Wycliffe's in 1380. And so we're starting to move faster now as we have set the foundation for this story. Thank you for your attention, and we'll see you next week.